Welcome to today's Explainer. We are putting on our detective hats today because we're stepping right into the middle of one of the absolute most fascinating literary mysteries of the ancient world. We're looking at what text-critical scholars call the Pastoral Epistles. You probably know them as the letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Now, for centuries, these have been read simply as the personal, final instructions of the Apostle Paul. But modern textual criticism, well, it reveals a completely different story, a story of systematic literary engineering that literally reshapes how we understand early Christian history. We're going to examine the evidence completely objectively today, just following the data exactly where it leads us.
Okay, let's dive into this because this simple question right here is the absolute core of our 2,000-year-old cold case. Did the historical Apostle Paul actually author these famous letters? To figure that out, we essentially have to treat the ancient text exactly like a modern crime scene and start dusting for fingerprints.
So here is our investigator's dossier for today. We'll start by outlining the mystery itself. Then we'll apply 3 independent levels of modern textual analysis to the evidence. Clue 1 will look at an alien vocabulary. Clue 2 breaks down the anatomy of a heresy. And Clue 3 traces the birth of an institution. Finally, we'll weigh all that evidence to ask the ultimate question. Was this a fraud or a literary tribute?
Let's start with Section 1, the mystery of the Pastoral Epistles and the modern scientific consensus.
You know, in modern and critical science, there is actually a really broad, firm consensus about this. The Apostle Paul did not write these 3 letters. Not a chance. Instead, scholars agree they represent an independent block of text, which is known as the Trito-Pauline tradition. And to understand why experts are so incredibly certain about this, you just have to look at the timeline. The authentic, undisputed letters of Paul were written between 50 and 60 CE. But the pastoral epistles, they were likely created between 100 and 120 CE. That is a highly suspicious gap of at least 1 to 2 entire generations after Paul's death.
That brings us to Section 2, Clue 1. Let's look at this alien vocabulary and see how syntax and word choice act as a writer's fingerprints.
For a textual critic, vocabulary and syntax are the ultimate fingerprints. You just can't hide them. When we compare the pastoral epistles to the undisputedly authentic letters of Paul, think Romans, Galatians, or 1 Corinthians, we discover a massive, glaring gap. We're suddenly dealing with an entirely different author. The core theological concepts that Paul repeated like a mantra, things like justification by faith, or freedom from the law, or that mystical union of being in Christ, they are completely missing from the pastorals, just gone. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the linguistic mismatch. Out of the 848 distinct Greek words used in the pastoral epistles, over 300 of them are what scholars call hapax legomena. That basically means these 300 words never appear, not even a single time, in any of the authentic Pauline letters. It's an entirely alien vocabulary.
And it's not just the words. You can actually feel the difference in the tone. It's like night and day. Authentic Paul writes like a rough, fiery Jewish rabbi. His Greek is dynamic, it's emotionally intense, and it reads like he's just pacing around a room, dictating his thoughts on the run. But the author of the Pastorals, they write like a polished Hellenistic philosopher. They use this highly refined language of contemporary moral philosophy, regularly dropping Stoic and Platonic terms like eusebia, which means piety, or sophrosine, meaning self-control. It's just a completely different voice.
Moving on to Section 3, Clue 2. Let's examine the anatomy of a heresy and verify this text's historical alibi.
So if the linguistic fingerprints don't match, what about the historical setting? Well, we can verify a text's historical alibi by identifying the specific enemies the author is fighting. In Paul's authentic letters, he is constantly battling Judaizers. These are people demanding that pagan converts get circumcised and follow the Torah. But in the pastorals, that conflict has completely vanished into thin air. Instead, the author launches very specific attacks against people obsessed with myths and endless genealogies. They're warning against teachers who forbid marriage and mandate asceticism, and who claim that the resurrection has already happened. Here's the catch. This does not match first-century traditional Judaism at all. This perfectly matches second-century proto-Gnostic systems, literally the exact same movements we find much later in the Nag Hammadi library.
And this brilliantly illustrates the problem of anachronism here. Claiming these letters were written by the historical Paul in the 1st century is exactly like finding a document allegedly written in the 1800s that warns humanity about the dangers of social media algorithms. The historical mismatch is simply way too great to ignore.
Let's move to Section 4, Clue 3. Let's move to and see how this builds into the birth of an institution and uncover the sociological motive.
Why would someone a generation or two later actually want to rewrite Paul's legacy?
To answer that, we have to examine what's called the Sitz-in-Leben. That's German for the actual life context and social reality of the church that's reflected in the texts. And the stark evolution of this movement is undeniable when you look at it. Let's look at eschatology first. Authentic Paul believed the end of the world was coming in his own lifetime, so the church was just a provisional, temporary community. But the pastorals? They reflected church settling in for centuries of stability. Next, consider leadership. Authentic Paul's communities were spontaneous, charismatic, and led by the Spirit. The pastorals established a rigid, hierarchical Roman institution with official bishops and presbyters. Finally, the role of women. Authentic Pauls celebrated female deacons and apostles, famously declaring that in Christ there is no male or female. The pastorals, however, demand female subordination, explicitly stating women must remain silent and will be saved through childbearing. It is a massive, fundamental shift from a radical apocalyptic movement to a stable, patriarchal Roman institution.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Fraud or Literary Tribute. We need to question the author's true intent.
So we have a different vocabulary, we have anachronistic enemies, and we have a completely different sociological structure. Does this mean the author of the pastoral epistles was just some malicious fraud trying to scam the early church? Well, actually no, not at all. We really have to understand the ancient world here. This practice is called pseudepigraphy. It wasn't a scam, it was a widely accepted, totally normal literary convention. Followers in the Platonic Academy or Neo-Pythagoreans, they constantly produced texts under their founders' names. It was a way to honor them and apply their ancient wisdom to contemporary issues. The pastoral epistles were produced by a Pauline school doing exactly the same thing.
So, what was their actual motive? Well, at the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries, the forming Orthodox Church had a massive problem on its hands. The historical Paul was just too radical, he was too hard to understand, and his writings were actively being hijacked by Gnostics, like Marcion, to support their own rival teachings. So an anonymous author stepped in to basically tame Paul. They wrote these fictional letters to his most loyal students, and in doing so, they turned Paul into an orderly Roman citizen, a strict defender of the patriarchal family, and the master architect of a safe, acceptable church hierarchy.
So the crucial point is that this wasn't some dark act of deception, it was an act of survival. This brilliant piece of literary engineering allowed the early church to integrate into society and withstand the immense crushing pressures of the Roman Empire. But it does leave us with a really profound question to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. By rewriting Paul to be safe, predictable, and institutional, did early Christianity secure its survival at the ultimate cost of losing its original, revolutionary dynamic? It's a fascinating trade-off to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this investigation today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.